You're listening to Upfront on the Voice of America. I'm Jackson Vunganyi in Washington. Now, as protests continue around the country, here in the U.S. capital of Washington, D.C., we continue to see some of the most intense protests against police brutality. Some of the protests are taking place around the White House, and earlier this week, police beat unarmed demonstrators and fired tear gas and other explosives into the crowds, while some protesters threw rocks and fireworks. VOA's Jason Patinkin filed this report, which contains graphic language and sounds of explosion.
A riot at the White House. Police and protesters clashed for hours in the heart of Washington, D.C. this weekend, part of a wave of nationwide protests demanding justice for George Floyd and an end to the systemic police brutality against black people in the United States. Floyd, a black man from the state of Minnesota, was killed by a white police officer last week. Tensions were high in Washington just after sunset and quickly escalated into violence. As unarmed protesters tried to walk toward the White House, police formed a line blocking them and unleashed pepper spray. A middle-aged black man lay on the ground, writhing in pain after the attack. Another unarmed protester, a white 22-year-old named Byron Bouchara from the state of Virginia, vented his anger at the officers after being sprayed in the face.
Our taxes go to your salaries, you monsters!
Nearing the White House gates, the protesters demanded police officers be held accountable for killing black people.
No justice!
At the gates, most protesters were peaceful, but some began throwing bricks and rocks at police, who responded with more pepper spray. Other protesters lit trash cans and dumpsters on fire and shot fireworks at the officers who were dressed in military-style gear. But there were sharp divisions between the protesters as to whether to throw objects at police and light things on fire. At one point, a fight broke out as one protester tried to stop another from setting a signpost ablaze. Deidre O'Brien, a black protester from Washington, D.C., said she helped put out a trash can fire and that she wanted the demonstrations to be peaceful.
We are out here tonight. We want to make sure that this is a peaceful demonstration, that at no means do we want to start anything, because we want to ensure that it's safe out here for us to be able to exercise our rights.
But the violence escalated anyway. After a firecracker landed among police and demonstrators, police fired tear gas, smoke bombs, and stun grenades indiscriminately into the crowds of unarmed protesters. VOA saw one photographer knocked to the ground, bleeding from his right eye. Another woman was hit in the leg with shrapnel from an explosive, apparently fired by police. VOA also witnessed police beating unarmed protesters who had their hands in the air. By midnight, the police stormed the area, and the air around the White House was thick with tear gas. But there appears no end in sight to the unrest in America's capital. Jason Patinkin for VOA News, Washington.
That was VOA's Jason Patinkin reporting from Washington on the protests taking place around the city, especially around the White House. Jason has also covered other protests around the world, and most recently in Sudan. Jason, thank you for joining us. You're on Upfront. Now, let me start off by asking you, you've been actively reporting on the COVID-19 pandemic, especially on how it is affecting or impacting Africa. When did you feel it was imperative to shift focus to the events that were taking place here in Washington, D.C.? Give us a little background on how we got here.
Yeah, so that was a great question, and it was an interesting decision. I think, COVID-19 is everywhere. It's worst in the U.S. of any country in the world right now in terms of total cases and total deaths. So I've been very cautious about going outside, about doing really anything outside. I've just been staying home for months, really, only going out when I absolutely have to and being very careful to social distance and wear a mask and stay away from people. But when this when these protests began, I realized that as a journalist, you have to think about, okay, where are my skills or where is my duty most needed? Where am I most needed as a journalist? And in this case, me and my colleagues decided that, well, given the level of violence, especially the level of police violence against protesters in the country, and given the scale of the protests, we thought that we needed to cover these protests, and so that included going outside. And so, of course, we've been wearing masks, but social distancing at these protests is pretty much impossible.
And we're still very much in the midst of a global pandemic with lockdowns in cities around the world, including here in Washington, D.C. area. Was there a sense for you that protesters were worried about the risk of contracting the virus? And what kind of precautions were you taking, or were they taking as they protested?
Absolutely. I mean, everyone's wearing masks, or I shouldn't say everyone, but most protesters are wearing masks. A lot of the police are also wearing masks. I think pretty much every journalist I saw out there were wearing masks. Certainly we were wearing masks, but that's really about all you can do. I mean, we don't shake hands with people or anything like that, and you try not to touch anyone, but in these crowded situations, it's very, very hard to avoid being within 2 meters. That's the safe distance of social distancing, is staying 2 meters from everyone. And that's basically impossible to do at some of these large protests where there's so many people crammed together facing off with the police. So it's a risk we take. We hope we don't get it. We're all wearing masks. We try to wipe down all of our equipment and disinfect everything that we have. We bring hand sanitizer with us. So throughout we are sanitizing our hands and sanitizing our equipment, but it's a risk, and it's a risk we unfortunately feel that we need to take. We're relatively young. A lot of the protesters are very young, teenagers in their early 20s, mid-20s. I'm in my early 30s, but COVID can get anyone. COVID infects anyone of all ages, and people of all ages have had, serious symptoms or even death from COVID. So it's a risk, but
right.
We feel it's needed.
Let's talk about the protests themselves. Now, some local leaders have been critical of what they say is troubling authoritarian symbology, military trucks around deployed in the city, heavily armed security personnel. Did you get the sense that this affected the mood and the tone of the protesters themselves?
Absolutely. It absolutely affected how the protesters were acting, and it affects how we as journalists have to do our job as well when there are military or militarized police in the vicinity. And so, I've been in war zones in other countries, and it's always a bit scary. We wear helmets, we wear protective flak jackets, and now we're doing that in the streets of the United States, in Washington, D.C. as well. And just that image of seeing these armored vehicles, of seeing heavily armed soldiers lining the streets, the protesters aren't really afraid of them. The protesters will often go right up to them and tell them what they think, and tell them that, a lot of the protesters think these are soldiers that are sent by an authoritarian government who is looking to crush dissent and to take away their rights. And they tell that right in the faces of those soldiers. And the soldiers, from what I have seen on Tuesday, were very calm and just stood there silently. But the more interaction between protesters and police in particular, that's where the violence starts, because I think a lot of the police, especially the federal police in Washington, D.C., don't really put up with much from the protesters. If even a plastic water bottle or some plastic water bottles are thrown, they might spray pepper spray or shoot tear gas or more than that, rubber bullets, other things. So it's and protesters have also been throwing fireworks at the firecrackers at the police as well. So that close contact between the two sides, that's what usually leads to the violence, whether it's protesters throwing things at the police or the police coming through and firing tear gas and rubber bullets and beating protesters, that sort of thing.
Now, you said you covered protests in Sudan. and other places, we saw videos of protesters in Sudan, for example, being beaten and shot at by regime forces. What are some of the parallels in terms of law enforcement response to the protests here in the U.S.?
Well, there have been some protesters who have died in the U.S. during these protests. And there were many protesters who died in Sudan during those protests, during the revolution of 2019. But we're at the very beginning of these protests here in the United States, and the protests in Sudan lasted for months and months and months. So it's hard to compare exactly, but I will say that, but as time goes on, if these protests go on, then we'll see if the death toll mounts, beyond a handful of people to many people. We'll have to see what happens.
But what about as a reporter? Did you feel, for example, you were more scared for your life, you're more worried for your safety in Sudan, as opposed to, say, being in Washington, D.C., in front of the White House?
That's a great question. I think what I was exposed to when I was in Khartoum last year during the revolution, there were some days when I was very scared, when there were, when we heard bullets flying and they were using live bullets and we had to dive on the ground, where we had to sneak around in our vehicles to avoid the checkpoints of the soldiers. We were in clinics or in hospitals that were surrounded by soldiers, and in those clinics or in those hospitals there were, people bleeding because they'd been shot. We haven't seen that level of intensity or that level of use of live bullets here in Washington, D.C. However, there have been a lot of explosives used, whether tear gas, bombs that go off, or fireworks from the protesters, and especially these sort of like flashbang grenades, or these small explosives that make a very loud noise and a little bit of shrapnel. The police have used those quite a lot, and they've launched them indiscriminately into the crowds. And so I was standing over the weekend, and there was a photographer standing next to me, and one went off. It knocked him to the ground. I was a bit further away, and he was bleeding out of his eye. So, it's definitely a bit scary. I would like to add, though, in terms of the similarities, the real similarity I see is between the protesters in the United States and the protesters in Sudan. They are young, they are determined, they are fed up with the system, they want change, they want equality, they are diverse. In Sudan, you had people of all races, of all colors, of all ethnic groups. And in the United States, it's the same. You see Black people, white people, Latino people, people from all different walks of life, all different backgrounds. So I think there's a lot of similarities between the young people who protested in Sudan last year and the young people who are protesting in America, or at least from what I've seen and the people I've talked to in Washington, D.C. this year.
Now, some Africans have been watching the protests in the past week, and saying that, the U.S. Government calls out police brutality in other countries, and instead that the government here should be addressing police violence in this country, especially in cases where people are peacefully expressing their First Amendment rights. What is your feeling on that?
Yeah, I think it will be very difficult in the future for other countries to take the U.S. seriously when the U.S. condemns those governments for using excessive force or cracking down on protesters or opposition or journalists, because we're seeing that happening now in America. So I think the U.S. will lose, or already has lost, a lot of global credibility because of the response to these protests.
I saw that you were hit by whatever projectile that was shot in your direction. How are you feeling?
Yeah, I'm feeling okay. I was lucky. I was wearing a flak jacket to protect myself and a helmet. And what happened was there was a line of police, and I was actually leaving. I was worried about being arrested because it seemed like there was a risk of arrest. So I was actually leaving the protests. And as I was walking away, there was a TV crew standing next to me in the street, and one of these explosives fired by police landed right near their feet and exploded. And so they started moving away, and I turned my camera on. And right as I turned my camera on, or a few seconds later, I looked and I saw a police officer raise his weapon and fire it. And we were actually yelling press. You know, I have this recorded, and you can hear someone yell press, that we are the media. But still, they fired in our direction, and it landed. The projectile, I think it was a rubber bullet, landed on the ground and ricocheted and hit me in the shoulder. Fortunately, I was wearing that flak jacket, and fortunately, it didn't bounce into my eye. But there have been, I think, over 100 incidents of either assaults or arrests of journalists in the United States during these protests, and numerous journalists have been hit in the eye by projectiles, by rubber bullets, or other things fired by police. So it's a very worrying situation for press freedom in America right now.
Before you leave, Jason, before we end this our conversation, I wanted to ask you to give some advice to young African reporters on the continent that you've covered extensively, whether you've been on the ground covering some of these type of protests. We know elections are coming up in various countries around the continent, and we know during these elections there's turmoil, police clashes. As a young reporter who is about to go to the field, what advice would you give them?
Well, first of all, I would say that I've learned a lot more from young African reporters, especially African freelance reporters, than I could probably teach them. So when I lived in East Africa and covered different countries in East Africa, you know, the people who I looked to for advice were always the African journalists, because they live in the countries, they know the countries, that's where they're from, and they know best how to keep safe. But I think from my perspective, you know, make sure you have the equipment that you need, whether maybe it's not a helmet and flak jacket, but maybe it is, but finding a way to get that equipment to keep yourself safe, I think, is a really important first step. And, you know, there are many resources online to where there are tips or advice on how to keep safe. And it's important also to you know, both stand up for yourself, but also know how to avoid putting yourself into a situation that maybe you can't get out of. And last of all, I would say never work alone. Always work with other journalists, even if they're not from your same newspaper or same radio station or TV station. If you can partner up with other journalists, two heads are better than one in some of these dangerous situations.
Jason Patinkin in Washington, D.C. Jason, thank you very much for speaking to us. Stay safe, my friend.
Thank you, Jackson. Really appreciate it.